good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all with our ongoing series on Indian writing in English. Today we will be talking on Indian English fiction origin, and for this very discussion we have once again with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is a retired professor from Department of English, University of Delhi, and Professor Prakash has immense experience. He has students worldwide. So let's welcome our guest Professor Anand Prakash, and let's try to understand more Indian English fiction origin. So let's welcome our guest Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Prakash, welcome to the episode lecture.
Thanks, Geetika, and welcome viewers. And today's discussion would be of a slightly general nature, because I would go into the processes through which Indian English fiction emerged in 19th century India. I am aware that fictions don't appear on a particular day with announcement. What happens is that certain trends in society, which began much earlier, finally crystallize into what can be called the clear, concrete reality. And at that point of time, when these trends are coexisting and helping each other to go further, certain individuals are on the scene, and these individuals then grab that historical opportunity to express themselves in a manner that may become later on what can be called Indian fiction. And if Indian fiction emerges in the English context in the 19th century, in the latter half of the 19th century, then the seeds of this fiction may have been there in the previous decades and even a century. So you have these seeds, for instance, in the 18th century. Then in the 19th century, these seeds, if I have to extend the metaphor, these seeds, become small plants, then they become trees, then they start bearing fruit. In the particularly second decade of the 19th century, you have a new kind of development, and that development is initially cultural in nature, linguistic in nature, communicative in nature, and later on, lectures have on this already been delivered by different scholars. Then within a couple of decades, you have people who come forward and say something concretely in a different mode. That mode is not the specific personal mode where two people sit in front of each other, they talk with each other and they reach a conclusion. The mode is that the person is face to face with what literally can be called a page, a white page with a pen in hand, and the person starts scribbling something on the page. And when something is written like this, all things are written like this, that you have a page in front of you. These days you may have the typewriter and the computer, but then there is a screen in front of us, and then we are grappling with that screen or with that paper, with the pen in hand, or with the knowledge of using the technology that is there today. So what is there actually on the page or on the screen that connects us with the world outside? And it's a philosophical question, and the answer lies in the fact that when you are face to face with a page or a screen, then actually you are face to face with yourself and with people who have interest in you. And languages exist in this form, communication exists in this form, and this language and this faculty of communication in human experience gives scope to people to express their experiences, and those experiences then are in the form of language, in the form of linguistic codes, become available to another person who knows those codes, and that is what literature is. So when I talk of the Indian English fiction and its origins, which is the topic today, then I'm aware that Indian English fiction is something that is in the process of becoming one. Initially, people want to communicate, and then they start gradually communicating in a mode that later on will be called the fictional mode. Now the question is, what are the urges? What are the tendencies that create that urge? What are the curiosities that people have that finally they start bursting forth into what can be called fiction? I don't have to explain fiction. All of you know, you are all scholars, young scholars of literature. I don't have to explain what fiction is. But I would definitely say that in the 19th century, this word was not in practice. This word was not in use, and people would not talk about fiction. They would talk about stories, this, that. There was no novel in the 19th century, in India that is. And there comes a time in the second half of the 19th century when there is a novel. So what led to that novel? This is the subject of discussion today. I will start my point with a reference to a young a scholar, contemporary scholar of name and fame, Mohan Ramanan, and I would like to build my argument around the points that he has made in one of his books, which is called the 19th Century Prose and published by Sahitya Academy. It's a good book. There are a large number of specimens, examples of this, and people in the 19th century who were writing English, who were expressing their ideas there, who were writing essays, who were entering into a kind of discourse with others. These people wrote the way that they felt was the useful way, and Mohan Ramanan has edited this book, and he has given samples of how people wrote and what they wrote. So there is a point that is made in the book, and as I was going over, I realized that this could help me perhaps explain the process which is behind the discussion today. There is a reference in the introductory essay in that book, and this reference includes words such as nationalism. The second word is modernization. The third use is forming ourselves. The fourth is peculiar dramatization of our culture. Now let's take these specific words one by one as to what they mean in the 19th century and how these will finally become a kind of backdrop to what I call the Indian English fiction. The first is nationalism. Now, nationalism today is quite in debate. People not only understand the term, but they also use it in specific ways. But in the 19th century, the word nationalism would occur to be an oddity. What is nationalism? What is a nation? How are we a nation? Maybe we have an identity. Maybe I'm a Hindu, I'm a Muslim, I'm this, I'm that. But then how am I part of a nation? This idea was not there. And this idea, if it was there in the minds of people. People who dreamed, they wanted to have a nation. They wanted to connect, not with just their neighbors or with people in the same town where they lived. They wanted to connect with, well, let's say Central India, Eastern India, the Southern India. And how could they do it? What was the connection? The connection would not be simply that they were human beings and we are human beings and therefore all human beings are together. If that were the case, then the whole world is one. But then in this particular geographical region, how do you connect with a person, a gentleman or a lady from South India, from the Eastern India? So it required a kind of an idea. And the idea that emerged, not because people wanted it only, but also because there was a need of this idea. And that idea that emerged was called nationalism, that we are a nation, that the people from South India and we have a connection, the people from the Western India or the Eastern India or the Central India, they all have a connection. And people were trying to define as to what this connection was. Now, one way to establish a link and a connection with people in other parts of the country, and in fact, they would not even talk of countries at that time. And even today, in large number of books, the word is not country, the word is subcontinent. Subcontinent means that it's more than a country, it's bigger than a country. Anyway, I wouldn't go into that. But I say that when one connects through the idea of a nation, then there are certain other perceptions that emerge, and these perceptions later on lead us to the idea of a nation. So basically, a nation in the 19th century sense is the process of linking of an individual with other individuals in what is called the subcontinent or the country India. That is what nation is, nationalism is. Then modernization, another good idea. The idea was scary also in the 19th century. It's not scary today. Now all of us want to become modern. But in the 19th century, becoming a modern was becoming a kind of a threat to those people who didn't consider themselves modern. They considered themselves orthodox. They considered themselves, people who belong to a particular faith, to a particular set of norms, and their identity would be explained in other terms than in terms of thinking modernity. So they were not modern, and they would not like to be modern. They would say, we belong to India, we belong to India's traditions, India's heritage, India's sets of principles. We want to be accepted in India as a part of it. But then when modernization came, then people became a little more confident. They started critically considering orthodoxy, critically considering dogma, critically considering those ideas which they didn't like, which kept them away from others. If you are not a modern in the 19th century, then you would not interact with the supposedly lower masses in the small town where you lived, in the village where you lived. You would not connect with them. But you would connect with anybody on the Indian soil at that time if you were a modern. If somebody was shabbily dressed, you wouldn't bother. You would say, actually, this is a human being, and as a human being, I can connect with this person. And if somebody is going in parda, a woman, then you could straight away say, why parda? I'm not observing parda as a male. So why is that women are observing parda? And when you realize that behind the veil is an individual, is a person who thinks, is a person who manages home, is a person who manages rearing of children, then you would realize that this person behind the parda is actually a very dignified, responsible, intelligent person. So why parda then? Why is the face being hidden? Now, the moment I raise this question of the uselessness, in fact, harmfulness of parda, then I become modern. And in the 19th century, people had started talking about these ideas that when one is a human being, one has the potentiality to grow, to interact, to develop oneself, to develop others, then how come that this person is not given a chance to, is not given an opportunity to become equal to me? So these ideas which appear so very simple today, these were daring, courageous ideas in the 19th century. And it is these ideas, that may have later on started a process in which people would think not just for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, they would think for, let's say, months, years, and decades. And therefore, this modernization, these new ideas, these started appealing to individuals and to groups in the 19th century. So see this process. We are a nation of individuals who are wedded to modernity. The third thing is forming ourselves. How do we form ourselves? A new idea again, and more than modern. How do I form myself? How do I make myself? This is a good question. And in the 19th century, people grappled with this question. How do you form yourself? One way to form yourself, one way to form myself in the 19th century was the way to go to school, to the college, to meet people in the evening around a subject which was of common interest for all of us. And when I ventured into these activities in the classroom, in the college, school, in the neighborhood, in the evening with my friends, then I was actually forming myself. How was I forming myself? And well, the answer is that when you go to a class, then you are entering into a relationship with the teacher. You are entering into a kind of dialogue with the book that you hold in hand. You work out things. There are certain questions, the answer to which you don't know, and you are thinking of certain answers. You may get the answer at the end of the class, but you may not. Maybe even after 10 days of study, you don't get the answer. And the teacher at the same time is offering a helping hand. Now see this relationship in the classroom. Actually, when you have passed out from a class, from a school after 5 or 10 years, then your neighbors straight away say, oh, you are a different person. So you were a person once, and the neighbor says after 5 years of your going to the school and another 5 years of going to the college, that you have become a different person. Now see the word become. Becoming means you have made yourself, and that's why you have become. So becoming is very important. And what makes you what forms you, how do you form yourself, is actually your conscious, accepted activity. So you were a student when you formed yourself as a student. And being a student is one of the best things in life. In fact, a person of 50 years, 70 years, 80 years, 100 years, a person who studies, a person who asks questions and answers them and accepts, admits failure if one is not able to, then this person is a student. And this person is a wonderful student, is a wonderful human being. So this is how we form ourselves. So in the 19th century, people started forming themselves. They would attend class, they would read books, and finally they would write. And they would communicate to others, and they would walk in groups, and they would sit in groups, and they would discuss in groups, and they would differ, and they would debate. So imagine, at the end of 10 years of this kind of activity, one has become very democratic, one has become very tolerant, one believes in difference of opinion, and 10 people differing with one another in their opinion, and still sitting together and sipping tea and coffee. These people have become wonderful human beings, and they have formed themselves. So this process of forming themselves, this occurred in a specific way in the 19th century, and this is the third point and the fourth point. And the fourth point is the dramatization of our culture. The culture was dramatized. Now what is the dramatization of culture? Well, in culture, you don't always say things which are after your heart. I don't say things which I like. I also sometimes assume things which I don't like. And when somebody asks a question, if I am a teacher, then a student can stand up in the class and ask a question which might rattle me, which might disturb me, which I may not like. But at the same time, I know that this is a question that has come from a person who sits in the class. And this person would have faced some difficulty in life, difficulty elsewhere, and that difficulty is sharing with me. Maybe he is wrong. Maybe I do not agree with him. But let me assume the role of this person. Let me, in a way, walk into his shoes and tell from his angle as to what the problem is. And when, one is face to face with a person who differs, and after that, the person who differs is able to convince me. So I have been changed by that person. And a kind of drama has happened in the meantime. So culture, gets dramatized. Culture actually becomes a kind of an activity in which different people take part. They stick to their position. And at the end of it, you realize that all of them were more or less wrong, more or less right. That's what happens in drama. When you watch a play in the auditorium, and when different characters clash, and finally they come to a resolution, or they may not come to a resolution, but they end somewhere. Then we come out and we start saying, well, that person was right, but even the other was right. What is happening? This is called the dramatization of culture. And this was happening in India in the 19th century. It is happening much more today. But if the 19th century had not had this kind of activity, then we wouldn't have been here today to discuss things from different angles. So this is what I am saying, that this dramatization of culture happened in the 19th century. Now you can ask a question from me regarding this. You can say, was it not happening all the time? Was it not happening in the 18th century? Well, you can say that. But on information, let me tell you that people didn't have a tradition, didn't have this usual practice in the 18th century to sit in the classroom, to sit in the school, to sit in the college, to sit, let's say in a chopal, the way people started sitting in the 19th century, and to get together over a cause in a kind of a campaign that is happening in society. That there are 10,000 people, 5,000 people who stand, or sit, waiting for the speaker to come. The speaker comes, and the speaker then expresses his views. This was happening in the 19th century. People were registering a kind of protest then, and when the protest occurred, then people came, they got together, and they became a kind of a threat also to the regime then, because there is a group of 10,000 people sitting at one place, listening to a person and getting convinced by him. Then a culture is developing, the culture of listening to others, the culture of getting together and pooling one's resources so that one understands, and this is called the dramatization of culture. And this also happened in the 19th century. This didn't happen earlier. I mean, historians will tell us that till the first quarter of the 19th century, people didn't have this tradition of walking to a particular place and listen to somebody who talked to them. There were, of course, sometimes discourses, but those discourses were that you went there not as much to learn as to merely be informed about what the story was or what religion says. But in the 19th century, people started doing this with respect to the ideas that were new to them, and they wanted to understand whether these ideas were efficacious, whether they were acceptable ideas or whether they were not. So, these are the 4 points I share with you, and I realize that these points are new to the 19th century, and sooner or later, hopefully sooner than later, these will compel certain people to write on their own, and what they would write would be important, but then they would definitely be doing something together. Then I am reading out this quotation and I will just finish this point then. What we here see, says Ramanan, is a people captivated by English and even forgetful of their own languages. This happens because education in the 19th century was happening in the medium of English, and the schools and colleges were letting people understand, learn English, read what was written in English, discuss it in English, and then inspire people to write in English. And this could not be afforded by the general mass of people. Only the elites in society, people who came from the landed classes, let's say in Bengal, these people would be able to spare their children the resources and time to go to the school, learn English, read English, and then also write in English. So somebody can look back and say, why write in English? Why read English? Why not our own languages? A good question. And the answer would be that Indian languages didn't have this heritage, and people didn't learn Indian languages in the schools. Maybe there were pathshalas, there were madrasas, there they were reading languages, but those languages then were confined to a certain vocabulary of religion. Those languages were not at that point of time engaged with understanding and articulating genuine, simple problems of life. They were talking about scriptures. So scriptures would be read and you can interpret the scriptures, but generally life is not allowed to come in. Or if it is allowed to come in, then it has to serve a kind of obedience to. It has to be obedient to the dictums that are there coming from religion. So in the 19th century, people would use English, interestingly, a language which nobody understands except a few, would read English, and then they'll start discussing Indian conditions in a language which they could not properly handle even. So anyway, what we see here is a people, India, captivated by English and even forgetful of their own languages. They were forgetful. They didn't understand. They didn't know. They at that time did not care to go to their own language like Hindi or Urdu or Bengali. But the positive aspect of this matter is that in such situations of conflict in the mind, that is between English on one side and the Indian languages on the other, the creative potential could not be suppressed. And I believe he says that in the 19th century Indian prose in English, we see both mastery of that language and a creative tension and discursive expressiveness. When you are writing, when you are speaking, then you are mastering English. At the same time, something is happening very anarchic in your mind, discursive. You don't know what you are saying, and other different ideas come and go, come into your mind and go away from there. And you have English where there is a control. So there you are feeling controlled. Elsewhere, your mind is straying from this way to that way, and there is a kind of tension between the two. Either you are controlling or you are not controlling. When you don't control your thoughts, it's discursive. This happens when you use your languages. In English, the English is always controlling your mind. So a kind of tension emerges, and that tension is between the controlled language or controlled use of language and a language, a native language, an Indian language, where you just don't bother as to what you are saying, but you say it. So tension emerges between anarchy on one side and control on the other. That's what is being said. We'll critically look at it later. Even when the bhasha is the Indian languages, in most cases Bengali, he says, was an ever-present challenge to English. You read English, but you always thought of your own language, and your mind strayed. So there was a tension. This creative tension, should you be controlled in your language, or should you go into your own languages where anything is allowed for your mind to think about? Once again, a very creative question. And this creative tension surely accounts for much of the literature of eloquence. This tension was there. People started discussing this tension. How is it that when I read English, then I learn this, and when I don't read English, then I think of my own languages where I start fighting with others. So there is a tension. In one case, you are reading something seriously. On the other hand, you are thinking in a language which doesn't control you at all. So you feel totally free. And this tension, may have given them a chance to think about their behavior, think about their tendencies, which will later on give scope to express yourself in a slightly different manner. So what have I said in the meantime? I have said that language in the 19th century is presenting a scene where it will control your thoughts to go in a certain direction, and that when you leave that particular scene of being controlled, you leave the room, for instance, you leave your study room, for instance, and go out and then talk to anybody for that matter, then these two activities, the one of controlled expression and the other of anarchic expression, these two activities, they in a way create a kind of stir in your mind, a stir in my mind, and I start thinking whether I should in fact do the same thing in my own language or not, or whether when I am reading English I should not give some freedom to myself, so that I start questioning it. So in both the cases, the process is creative, and the word creative is a very, very difficult word. Do I create? How do I create? What I create? And literature is called creation, and literary activity is called creative activity, which means that already some kind of a background is set in which creative activity will take a very clear, a very, very rock-like, a very hard and real shape, and the shape will be called finally literature. I hope that I have been able to make point of this variety somewhat understandable to you, and I am sure that we can take it up further as we go into the areas of literature further. Thank you. Well, friends, now we take up the discussion about the processes that existed in the 19th century to a stage where literature will become a clearly defined activity. And I'll be making 3 or 4 points with respect to this. I'll refer to certain developments in the 19th century, particularly around the time which can be called the mid-century, and the individuals who were coming forward to write literature and what inspired them to write, what compelled them to articulate their responses, their emotions, their feelings in such a manner that they could be effectively communicated to the reader. So these things, will help us understand the way Indian novel in English originated and assumed concrete shape. The first point that I make in this regard is about adoption of prose on a big scale by thinkers and visionaries. Adoption of prose. Actually, there is no prose worth the name that has been preserved in India till the 19th century. People spoke, they also gave sermons, they gave discourses, they talked to large gatherings. This was there. There might have been mushairas, there might have been poets meetings, and there would be applause and all those things. This social activity would have been there definitely in the previous centuries too. Congregations of a different kind, they would have been there. But in the 19th century, what happens is that in the written form, poetry is being replaced by prose. And this is a tremendous change, in linguistic communication. That when language is written, then it is not merely to present things in verses, things in verse, in versification, in poetry, but that people start following the same way in writing as they follow in speaking. I don't have to go into the earlier periods to tell you that there would have been a time in India when even scientific knowledge would be imparted in verse form. I would not go much into that is the case. But in the 19th century, people want to say things in their writing, write things in their writing the same way as they speak. So if I have a sense of pain and I'm sharing that pain with my friend, with my spouse, or with my children at home, with my family members, then I do the same thing when I talk about this pain through the written language on the page. And this is a new development because prose is something very, very prosaic, very, very simple, something that should not get regard and respect from me, because it will go away, it will disappear. It doesn't mean much. But in the 19th century, what happens is that what is supposed to be simple and apparently meaningless is very meaningful. And therefore, if I speak in prose, which I always do, then I should also write in prose. And initially, people would have a kind of a guilty conscience, that they would have kind of a complex that they were not saying anything important. But then people started saying something important in prose when they spoke. If they were discussing, let's say, a social issue, maybe some kind of casteism, if they started discussing the question of sati, which was a burning issue at that time in both the senses, that it allowed women to burn themselves, it allowed that women should be burnt alive on the fire. So this became a serious issue, and if it's a serious issue, and if you talk in prose, then the prose becomes serious. If there is a institution of Thuggi in India in the 19th century, and the regime wants to take action against Thuggi. Thuggi is something that is making a fool of others, that is snatching money from them, that is violent, that also believes in killing. Then it's a very dangerous, harmful activity. So it's a serious business. If it's a serious business, and if it is being talked about in a serious manner on the street, then why not this be written about on a piece of paper with the same seriousness? So that is the way prose originates that you write what you speak, and if what you speak is serious, then what you write also can be serious. So prose can be taken seriously then. So this starts happening in the 19th century, that people will use prose for serious purposes. They will use prose to communicate things which pain them, which make them happy, which make them full with ideas, which inspire them. So if that can be done in life in prose, how come this can't be done on the page where you are writing formally? So adoption of prose on a big scale, in the cities particularly, in the big towns particularly, because many more educated people were there in the middle of the 19th century, and these people were in the habit of writing and sending letters and sending communications to newspapers. There were newspapers in the 19th century, and so if something was there in the written form, it had a kind of respectability, and if it had respect, that respectability went further when people started discussing things in the language that they would use in the streets. So it happened on a big scale by thinkers and visionaries. Now this visionaries part I particularly want to emphasize. Thinkers, all right, they think about society and its ways, and they learn and they develop and they evolve and they formulate all those things. But when one talks of visionaries, then we should keep in mind that the person starts envisioning, imagining, dreaming. You dream, you envision, and you imagine. Now something that you imagine is not exactly that you see in life. Imagining means something out of the life, or something that is extended much beyond life would permit. That is called imagining. And there are people who believe in dreaming, and they dream about, well, today there is a painful happening in my life, tomorrow this should not happen. If it doesn't happen, how would the society be? What would it look like? How will people talk? And I've already gone into a trance. I've already started thinking about 10 years ahead. That is called dreaming. And if dreaming is for a good cause, if dreaming is to uplift society, is to make it happier, then I would say it's a vision. It is something that I want to stick to, I want to remain in. So people become visionaries when they think seriously for some time, because then they go from the present into the future. So these visionaries were created in the 19th century. Earlier there were visionaries only among poets, but now these visionaries would also be among those people who would not use verse but prose. So you can be visionaries in prose too, and in prose a vision becomes much more exact, a vision becomes much more imaginable, much more clear, and other people also then can start imagining with the help of the person who is writing prose on the page. In any case, if I want to write and I am not exactly literate or only semi-literate, then I can tell myself, well, let me try. If this person can write in prose, then I also can say something in prose in my own writing. So in a way, I am being induced to using prose on the page, and this prose does justice to my feelings. So the number of people who would write in different languages, and particularly English, their number is growing, and visionaries are being created now in the 19th century. The development was unprecedented. It was not there earlier. This is only in the 19th century. People are educated. They use pen and paper. They have that kind of rationality which gives them confidence to share their views with their neighbors, with their readers. And if they have this confidence, then 19th century is a different kind of a period. And this process was unprecedented. It was not there earlier. It started with establishment of universities. There were 4 or 5 universities, if not more, in the 19th century. They all started in the mid-19th century, and they were in different parts of the country. There was one in Madras then, there was one in Bombay, there was one in Calcutta, and like this. And these universities had scholars from that area, and these scholars would spend their time reading, discussing, writing, and their number was growing in the 19th century. And these universities became centers then of learning, and learning gave an impetus to what I have already called envisioning, imagining. So establishment of universities in the 19th century, bringing into being journals and newspapers which were not there earlier. So you have now newspapers, you have journals where serious writing is done, and that writing then is made available for use by people elsewhere in smaller towns. So this process has begun in the 19th century. Bringing into being journals and newspapers for dissemination of information and ideas. Information is fine, well, information is very important, but then ideas. People do not have concrete ideas, but then they start reading, then they have ideas, first in the amorphous form, in a form which can't be easily captured, can't be easily checked. But later on, this amorphous quality of ideas, this gets shaped into good ideas, clear ideas. So ideas are entering people's heads, there they are growing further, then they are being shaped through words for use by others, and this process becomes in the 19th century in India, and this is happening in the medium of English. The next point, I hope this point is clear, that people use English more and more. There are more universities where people get together, they read more, they think more, they debate more, they disagree more, and then they go back and change their ideas accordingly, and that's how things have started happening on a different level. This point is clear, I hope. Then the next point is a new kind of poetry on lines of romanticism in England became a vehicle of creative expression. On lines of romanticism, romanticism was a very powerful revolutionary movement in the 18th, 19th century England. I call it romantic because it took help from imagination, and whatever was supposed to be real was challenged by romanticism in the latter half of the 18th century and the early quarter of the first quarter of the 19th century. And this romantic movement was romantic only in the name, because basically what they were doing was that they were talking about the village, they were talking about the small town, they were talking about the poor people, illiterate masses. And these illiterate masses, these poor people, these people coming from the villages, these people didn't have control over the language, and they spoke simple language. So romanticism said, use simple language. Because ordinary people dreamed, romanticism said, keep dreaming. So if you keep dreaming, if you use simple language, then it so happens that finally ways of simple living, ways of the village, ways of the small town, these start entering literature. And this was a revolutionary activity. Revolutionary, I say with full force, in the sense, that literature had not so far talked about the ordinary details of life. They only talked about kings and queens. They only talked about great scholars. They only talked about philosophers. But now in the 19th century, when romanticism comes to England in this form, that ordinary people, illiterate people are being discussed in romantic literature. That is the time around which Indians also start learning English. So anyway, they are reading, let's say, contemporary poems by Wordsworth, poem by Keats, poems by Coleridge, poems by Byron and Shelley. They are reading them, and all these people are talking about simple things, things which connect with the ordinary human beings. So this romantic movement becomes some kind of a precursor to what India will gain in terms of freedom, in terms of equality, in terms of justice. So in the middle of the 19th century, what happens is that people read English, and through English they are in touch with romanticism. And this romantic movement that was there in England, this starts giving them new ideas, new perceptions. They compel them, that they inspire them to make experiments with their own language in such a manner that simple language starts looking beautiful. And when people who use English, now they are not as much controlled by grammar, they want to write in their own way. And romanticism, the romantic movement is telling them to make experiments with language. So they make experiments with language. And if you start experimenting with language, with words, if you start using in different senses, if you start coining new phrases, if you are using words in such a manner that difficult ideas can be expressed effectively through them, then you are only a step from creative writing. You are a step from, let's say, writing a novel, writing a poem. So this is what is happening. People were becoming poets they were becoming writers, they were becoming novelists in this process of struggling with language, learning a language of the street, adopting it, and then struggling to make it so very fine, so very effective that it will express the ideas that you have in your mind. So, a new kind of poetry on the lines of Romanticism in England became a vehicle of creative expression in India. It stressed feelings and emotions instead of orthodox principles. Romanticism was against orthodoxy. Romanticism was also against religion. It was against the kind of dogmatic view which compelled people to stick to a certain framework. Romanticism gave the 19th century writers and readers what can be called a genuine sense of freedom. And this freedom is the basic requirement of creative writing. So, if Indian fiction is originating in the 19th century, then it is originating on the strength of gaining freedom, on the strength of experimentation. And this is what English has made possible in the 19th century atmosphere of culture. The new verse also opened doors to ordinary people, because the effect was of Romanticism, particularly young men and women as well as the poor and helpless. So, if they were poor and helpless, if they were young men and women in England, they were so in India. So, when you wrote in English and you wrote inspired by a romantic movement, and if romantic poets were seen to be interested in ordinary masses, men and women, then Indian poets also would think of the same and would locate the ordinary people in India, men and women who dreamed in a particular manner, and they would then put them into their own poems. So, this particular influence of romantic poetry was quite infectious, and the infection caught on, and we in the 19th century we had a large number of romantic poets in India. And in other lectures, the MOOCs lectures that we are running a program about, these lectures, some of them are talking about poets such as Derozio, who was a romantic poet, who was influenced by English Romanticism, and who was talking about young men and women, and he was talking about ordinary masses, the illiterate ones. He was talking about the slaves. So, slaves have an entry, young men and women have an entry into his poetry because it is romantic. Therefore, a new thing is happening in the 19th century ethos, and this has a certain link with Indian English, which is also in the meantime evolving into an Indian English. It is not exactly like English is spoken in England. It has its own Indian flavor, and things are mixing in such a manner that finally you have a scene in which people will burst forth in prose talking about simple people, and then they will start writing also fiction and novels. The other point, next one, the third point I am making in this lecture, this is in new creative utterances, in poems to be precise, that took interest in ordinary happenings of the day, one could note faint presence of narrative. I use words a bit carefully. I say creative utterances. So, you speak 3 or 4 sentences in a creative manner, you are imagining, and through imagination you are expressing things which are dear to you, and you want to share them with the reader. Now, this is a creative utterance. Now, you don't know what exactly you are going to say, because it is creative. You are exploring yourself through language. What happens is that after the 3rd or 4th sentence, there is reference to a character. There is a person that appears in your mind, that appears in my mind. It is a young man, it is a young woman. They like each other, and they know that Indian society will not allow them to remain together for some time. So, they will have to part their ways. If they part their ways with each other, then they will be full of sadness. They will have a longing for each other. Suppose this thing develops in my mind as I write, and I then express it. I capture it on the page. What has happened? Already I have allowed 2 or 3 people to enter my page to show their mental makeup to me through my verse. And then I also say that they can't remain together for more than, let's say, a month or so, and then they have to part ways. and they will never meet after that, and the sense of longing is that which I am creating on the page. What is happening actually? A story is happening. A story in which the young man and woman talked to each other, got attracted towards each other, then realized that their friendship cannot last long, so they went away, and that created a sense of longing, a sense of pain, and sentimental isolation. So on the page, what I have said is simply what appeared in my dream, creative dream. Therefore, I wrote. But when I had finished, I know that I have already told the story in time. This was the beginning, this was the middle, this was the end, and this was happening in the poems. It is not happening in prose initially. This is happening in poems, but the poems are getting very close to prose, and there the story is entering on its own, and it's a story of a different kind. It's not a story about Krishna and Radha. It's not a story about other religious figures. It's not a mythical story. It's a story that is picked up from the ordinary details of the life that existed at the time. So there is a faint presence of the narrative, the story. So the story starts occurring in the poem. So new verse opens doors to ordinary people, particularly young men and women, as well as the poor and helpless, and in creative utterances, one could note faint presence of narrative, story, a tale at once ordinary and away from traditional cultural attire. Traditional it is not, and it has a cultural dress of its own. It can be from one part, and there it speaks the language of that part, and it arouses curiosity. If in the poem you bring some kind of a experience which is somewhere near you, then your curiosity is aroused in what individuals did in the course of living. So therefore, these individuals who are a part of the story, they start attracting attention. They start interesting us in this. So this is happening, and yet more, the characters are made to speak and dig out inner emotional resources for sharing, asserting, or at least daring to come out of themselves to say. In a poem, I present the picture as a poet of a person, and this person I am talking about, but at one point of time I say, okay, this is what he said. What he said can be described in one sentence, half a sentence. But maybe he had something more to say. Maybe there was something problematic about what he was saying, and he could not clear it in that half a sentence. Then I, as a writer of the poem, I would give this person a chance to say what he wants to say, what he can say in 2 sentences, 3 sentences. What am I doing? What I am doing is, I am giving a chance to speak his mind, to speak his intent at length. And in the process, I am allowing him to have what can be called a dialogue. So imagine, in a poem, I am not merely presenting the mental state in my own words, I am presenting the mental state in the words that belong to the speaker himself or herself. And therefore, you have a story, you also have a character, and that character speaks. And whatever the character speaks is his language or her language, it's not my language, I am a writer. So this is happening in the poems in the let us say, second quarter of the 19th century, and around the third quarter, a wholesome, a full-scale narrative, a full-scale story emerges in the poems, and it starts emerging outside the poems. Maybe I am writing an essay, and in the middle of it, I am struck by a certain instance, and then because I know that this essay will be read by individuals, for some time, and therefore these individuals will see that this kind of a course happens in the poem. Therefore, I would try to capture it in prose also later. In my essay also, there will be a story, and that story can develop in the essay. And I don't have to go to the rise of the English novel, the origins of the English novel in the 18th century. What happened at that time was that in the essay, instances occurred. Those instances also inspired the writer to say more about things, in the form of the essay. So essay and novel, they became together. In India also it might have happened. A poet writes an essay, and in the essay there is an instance. That instance has characters, and the characters speak. And when they speak, it becomes an essay again. Maybe there is a long speech, when they speak, and therefore, the novel has already entered its stage of infancy. It's its childhood. So the novel now from childhood will grow into adulthood later. So you have expressions of this kind in the early writings in the 19th century. In Derozio you have prose pieces. He writes letters, and in letters he is talking like a poet. But then sometimes there can be traces of what can be called the narrative. So you have in the mid-century and in the third quarter writers such as Sorudat. Sorudat is a poetess, is a poet. She is writing letters. She is keeping a diary, and she also is trying her hand at writing a novel. And this novel has all the ingredients that I have talked about in the course of today's discussion. You have Michael Madhusudan Dutt. You have Bankim Chandra Chatterjee in the third quarter of the 19th century. You have Dinbandhu Mitra, who is writing a play, and in a play there is a narrative, and in a play there are dialogues. Sometimes other people can take cue from Dinbandhu Mitra, and they can use the dialogue, the words, the long sentence, the long speech, the way Dinbandhu Mitra has used in his play. And all these people come to mind. So these would in time stir the imagination of people, thinking through their own languages, coining new phrases, idioms, forging expressions, symbols, metaphors to voice concerns, fears, apprehensions, hopes. What is a novel? A novel is all these things put together. And in the third quarter of the century, Indian writers in English, they have started toying with the idea of writing novels, and 2 or 3 novels emerged. I refer to Sorudat. There is an unfinished novel by her. There is a novel in English by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who would later on shift to Bangla. But his first novel is an English novel, and we have a lecture lined up in this, and we will be discussing his first novel. It is called Rajmohan's Wife. It's in English, and this is supposed to be one of the early fictional creations by an Indian writer. I conclude with this final brief remark. Fiction is an amalgam of fancy, real thought, actual life conditions, reactions and responses that were indeed struggles of an individual mind to cope with existing pressures. Individual minds express themselves through fiction, through a narrative. And this narrative combines so many different aspects of experience, and it gives a specific shape to the narrative, and that narrative finally becomes the Indian novel in English. This in brief became the backdrop of fiction in Indian English, and yet more strongly and significantly in India's own languages. Later on, Indian fiction in English also will inspire writers to write in their own languages. And in fact, Indian languages would go far ahead of the Indian English fiction with time to come. And I hope, viewers, that you have had a view of how, in the 19th century, in its potentialities, a kind of new literary form emerged in India, and that came to be called as fiction. And since it was in English, therefore we can comfortably say, conveniently say, that this was Indian writing in English in the fictional form. I hope you have partly or fully, appreciated the point that I have made. And finally, let me thank you for this. Come with questions, and you can ask questions. And I think Gitika will tell us as to how to approach people who speak from the days here. And you are welcome to take part in this process further. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much. And dear friends, of course, you can contact us. You can write to us at info.cc@nic.in. Your all the queries are welcome. So we would be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.